On September 7th, 1191, 12,000 exhausted crusaders, battered, bloodied, and pushed to the brink of collapse, turned and obliterated 30,000 of Saladin's finest warriors in just 17 minutes. What happened in those final moments at Arsuf would shatter the myth of Saladin's invincibility forever. 700 crusader casualties, 7,000 Muslim dead, a 10-to-1 kill ratio that defied every law of medieval warfare. The fate of the Holy Land, and perhaps all of Christendom, hung on a single cavalry charge. By the end of this video, you'll understand how Richard the Lionheart orchestrated the most devastating counterattack in crusading history, why Saladin's greatest strength became his fatal weakness, and the 17 minutes that changed medieval warfare forever. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Richard had been waiting for this moment for 7 agonizing days. What made him wait until his men were dying? How could exhausted knights who'd marched for days in brutal heat suddenly explode with such devastating force? And why did Saladin's battle-hardened veterans, men who'd conquered most of the Holy Land, flee from an army they outnumbered more than 2-to-1? The answer lies in the deadliest weapon of the medieval world. Not the lance, not the sword, but something far more powerful: discipline forged in desperation. Jerusalem itself hung in the balance that September morning. The Third Crusade's survival depended on a single trumpet blast, a signal that would either save Christianity's presence in the Holy Land or see it drowned in blood. To understand how 12,000 men shattered 30,000, we need to step back 7 days to when 2 of history's greatest military minds began their deadly chess match on the coastal plains of the Levant. Richard had just secured Acre after a brutal 2-year siege. The Lionheart, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, stood as Christendom's greatest warrior king. But across the dusty plains waited his match, Saladin, the Kurdish sultan whose very name meant righteous of the faith, the man who'd recaptured Jerusalem and shattered crusader power at the disaster of Hattin just 4 years earlier. This wasn't just a battle between armies, it was a collision between 2 military philosophies, 2 faiths, and 2 men who respected each other even as they sought the other's destruction. After Hattin in 1187, where Saladin had annihilated the Crusader army and captured the True Cross, the Muslim world believed the Frankish threat was finished. Jerusalem had fallen. The coastal cities surrendered one by one. Christianity's century-old presence in the Holy Land seemed doomed. Then came the Third Crusade, and with it, Richard the Lionheart. The 33-year-old English king had already proven himself the finest military mind in Europe. But Saladin, at 53, commanded an empire stretching from Egypt to Syria, with decades of experience fighting Frankish knights. He knew their strengths, the devastating heavy cavalry charge, and he knew their weaknesses, heat, impatience, and the burden of their own armor. The next 60 seconds would determine the fate of the Holy Land. After taking Acre, Richard faced a critical decision: march inland directly to Jerusalem or secure the coast first. He chose the conservative route, south along the Mediterranean to Jaffa, keeping his fleet close for supplies. It seemed safe, logical, predictable. Saladin smiled when his scouts reported Richard's choice. The Sultan had been planning for exactly this move. The 80-mile coastal road from Acre to Jaffa passed through perfect ambush country. Rolling hills on the left, the sea on the right. No room to maneuver, nowhere to run. The Crusaders would be trapped in a narrow corridor of death. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about these 2 commanders. They weren't just generals, they were students of each other. Richard had studied every battle Saladin had won. Saladin had interrogated, captured knights about Richard's tactics in Europe. Each knew the other's playbook. What followed would be more than a battle. It would be a masterclass in patience, deception, and the art of springing a trap on someone who knows it's there. As August turned to September, 30,000 Muslim warriors gathered in the hills above the coastal road. Richard's 12,000 men began their march south, knowing full well what awaited them. But as Richard's army began its march south, Saladin had already set his trap. The Sultan's strategy was elegant in its simplicity: bleed them slowly, break their discipline, then annihilate them when they finally snapped. The armies that gathered for this clash represented the pinnacle of medieval warfare. Richard's force of 12,000 was small but elite. At its heart, 2,000 mounted knights, including 300 Hospitallers in the vanguard, 300 Templars guarding the rear, warrior monks whose discipline was legendary. The remaining 1,400 knights came from England, France, Normandy, and the Crusader states. Each knight was a walking fortress, 40 pounds of chainmail, massive helm, kite shield, 12-foot lance, and broadsword. Supporting them, 10,000 infantry, half spearmen with shields, half crossbowmen whose bolts could punch through Muslim armor at 200 yards. But their greatest asset wasn't their weapons, it was their formation. Richard had drilled them relentlessly in a defensive box that moved like a single organism, shields overlapping, spears bristling outward, crossbowmen protected in the center. Then Saladin made his fatal error by choosing the wrong battlefield psychology. His host of 30,000 was built for mobility and harassment. The core, 10,000 Mamluk heavy cavalry, slave soldiers trained from childhood, the finest horsemen in the Islamic world. They wore lighter armor, leather and mail designed for speed, not prolonged melee. Their primary weapons, composite bows that could loose 12 arrows a minute, curved sabers for close combat, and most crucially, fresh horses, 3 or 4 per man. The remaining 20,000 were mixed forces, Bedouin light cavalry for scouting and harassment, Turkish horse archers, Kurdish infantry, and Egyptian regulars. But Saladin's real weapons were psychological, drums and cymbals to unnerve the enemy, dust clouds to obscure vision, and the constant rain of arrows designed to break resolve. The killing ground was set, but not how Saladin imagined. The coastal plain near Arsuf offered everything the Sultan needed. The ancient Roman road ran just 2 miles from the sea, bordered by sand dunes and scrubland that provided perfect cover for ambush. To the east, the forested hills of Samaria where Muslim cavalry could mass unseen. The Crusaders would have to march through a 10-mile gauntlet with the sea blocking retreat on their right, Saladin's army pressing from their left. But hidden in the ranks, one knight was about to change everything through sheer impatience. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic reversals. The heat was already building. September in the Levant meant temperatures over 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Every crusader carried at least 40 pounds of metal armor that would become an oven under the desert sun. Water was rationed. The nearest wells were in hostile territory. Richard understood the mathematics of attrition. Each day of marching in armor drained strength. Each hour under arrow fire tested discipline. Saladin was betting the Crusaders would break formation to charge their tormentors, and in the open ground, lighter Muslim cavalry would cut them to pieces. It had worked at Hattin. It had worked against every Frankish army for decades. The ground literally shook. Here's why. 30,000 horsemen were now shadowing the Crusader march. On September 3rd, as Richard's column departed Acre, Muslim outriders appeared on the eastern hills. The chess match had begun. Every piece was in position. 2 brilliant commanders, each believing they could predict the other's moves. What Richard did next defied every rule of medieval warfare. Instead of rushing to cover the 80 miles to Jaffa quickly, he ordered a pace of just 10 miles per day. 3 days' march stretched to 8. It seemed like madness, giving Saladin more time to gather forces, more opportunities to attack. On September 3rd, the deadliest game of patience in history began. The sun rises on September 3rd, and with it comes the first whistling death. Arrows arc from the hills, not a concentrated volley, but a constant, maddening drizzle. Saladin's horse archers sweep in, loose their shafts, wheel away before the crossbowmen can respond. This isn't meant to destroy, it's meant to torment. Richard's response reveals his genius. The army moves in 3 columns. Hospitallers leading, the royal standard in the center with Richard himself, Templars guarding the rear. The baggage train crawls between the infantry and the sea. Most crucially, the knights stay mounted but don't charge. They endure. Day 2 brings escalation. The arrows fall heavier now. Muslim cavalry grows bolder, sweeping closer. A Hospitaller knight takes an arrow through his eye slit. Another's horse screams and falls, pierced by 3 shafts. The urge to charge burns in every warrior's heart. These men were bred for offensive action, trained to smash enemies with overwhelming force. Watching their brothers die without responding went against every instinct. But Richard had given explicit orders. No one charges without the signal. 3 trumpet blasts. Any man who breaks formation faces execution. The Lionheart rides up and down the column, his presence alone keeping discipline intact. Let them waste arrows on our shields, he commands. Our time will come. In that moment, mathematics stopped making sense. By day 3, Muslim sources report loosing over 400,000 arrows. Yet the crusader formation holds. The crossbowmen take their toll. Saladin loses 400 men in 3 days to those deadly bolts, but it's a price he's willing to pay. His cavalry has unlimited arrows. The crusaders' crossbow bolts are running low. Day 4. The heat becomes an enemy deadlier than arrows. Men march in full armor under the blazing sun. The infantry must maintain shield wall discipline while sweat blinds them, while their tongues swell from thirst. Knights cook inside their mail, horses foam and stumble. The pace slows to 8 miles per day, then 6. What happened next shocked even Richard himself. On day 5, Saladin commits more forces, not just harassment now, coordinated attacks on the rearguard. The Templars, pride of Christian knighthood, are forced to ride backwards in their saddles, facing the enemy while their horses are led by squires. It's humiliating. It's also brilliant. They present a wall of steel. No horse archer dares approach too closely. The sound alone was worth 1,000 men. Muslim drums thunder from dawn to dusk. Cymbals clash. War cries in Arabic mix with the whistle of arrows. It's psychological warfare at its finest. Some younger knights crack. They spur forward, break formation, and die, surrounded and cut down by circling horsemen. Their screams carry back to the column. Day 6 brings crisis. The hospitallers at the van have endured the worst. Every man sports wounds. Dead horses line their path. Master Garnier de Nablus watches his brotherhood bleed and die without striking back. His sergeants report. The men are at their limit. They speak of charging with or without orders. Watch what happens when discipline meets desperation. Richard shifts his forces. Fresh knights replace the battered van. The wounded move to the protected center, but he won't speed the march. He won't give Saladin the running battle the Sultan craves. 10 miles from Arsuf. 8 miles. 6 miles. Each mile costs blood. Here's where legend meets cold, hard reality. Contemporary accounts describe supernatural endurance. Knights marching with a dozen arrows protruding from their armor. Sergeants holding the line with broken shafts jutting from their shields like porcupine quills. One Templar reportedly continued fighting with 6 arrows in his body, only collapsing when the 7th pierced his neck. The 7th day, September 6th, Saladin realizes his mistake. The Crusaders haven't broken. They're coiled tighter than a trebuchet spring. Tomorrow they'll reach Arsuf's fortified camp. His window is closing. The Sultan makes a fateful decision. Commit everything. No more harassment. Tomorrow will bring the decisive battle. That night, Richard gathers his commanders. Tomorrow, Saladin will throw everything at us. He must. It's his last chance before we reach safety. The Lionheart's eyes burn with something between exhaustion and anticipation. When he does, when he finally commits his reserves thinking we're finished, he doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. Here's what military historians still argue about. Did Richard plan this all along? Did he deliberately slow the march, deliberately appear vulnerable, deliberately let his men suffer, all to lure Saladin into overcommitting? Then came September 7th, the day patience became a weapon. Dawn breaks over the plains of Arsuf. The Crusader column forms up, battered, bloodied, but unbroken, just 5 miles to safety, but the Muslims mass in unprecedented numbers. This isn't harassment anymore. Saladin has committed his entire host. 30,000 warriors flood from the hills like a dark tide. The Sultan's deployment reveals his strategy. Crush the Crusader rear, create panic, roll up the column like a carpet. His nephew Taqi al-Din commands the right wing, 8,000 veteran cavalry. The center holds 10,000 Mamluks under direct command. The left wing, another 8,000 under Muzaffar al-Din. The remaining forces create a tactical reserve. You have to understand what 7 days of arrow storms does to a man's psyche. The hospitallers in the van are wound tighter than crossbow strings. They've watched brothers die unavenged. They've endured mockery from Muslim warriors who ride just out of reach, shouting insults, challenging their manhood. Master Garnier de Nablus grips his reins with white knuckles. His knights mutter prayers through clenched teeth. The first assault strikes at 9 a.m. Not the usual harassment, a coordinated hammer blow against the Hospitaller rear guard. Thousands of horse archers converge, darkening the sky with arrows. The drumming reaches deafening levels. Muslim cavalry charges to saber range, strikes, wheels away. The Hospitaller losses mount catastrophically. Picture this. You're a knight in full mail, already exhausted from 7 days of hell. Arrows slam into your shield with impacts that jar your entire arm. Your horse screams and dances as shafts seek its unarmored legs. You watch the knight beside you topple with an arrow through his neck. Every instinct screams, charge, attack, do something. But Saladin had one more card to play, a personal challenge. Taqi al-Din himself leads a charge directly at the Hospitaller standard. It's a calculated insult, designed to break their legendary discipline, and it nearly works. Garnier de Nablus sees red. 7 days of suppressed rage boil over. I can bear this no longer. The Hospitaller master's cry carries over the din. Without waiting for Richard's signal, without orders, he couches his lance. His knights see their leader move, and instinct takes over. 300 Hospitallers spur their destriers into a full charge. Remember this number, 17 minutes. That's all it took to change history. Richard sees the Hospitallers break formation prematurely. In 3 seconds, he must decide, recall them, and watch them die unsupported, or commit everything. Military genius shows itself in split-second decisions. The Lionheart doesn't hesitate. Now, bear aid to the Hospitallers. Richard signals his trumpeters. 3 long blasts split the air, the sound every crusader has been praying to hear for 7 agonizing days. What followed was not a battle, but a mathematical impossibility. The entire crusader cavalry, 2,000 knights, explodes into motion simultaneously. But this isn't a mob charge. Even in their fury, discipline holds. They maintain formation. Hospitallers on the right, Templars on the left, Richard with the English and French in the center. 3 iron wedges accelerate toward the Muslim line. You can almost hear the moment everything changed. The drumming falters. Muslim horse archers who've been dancing out of reach for days suddenly realize the dynamic has shifted. They're no longer hunters but hunted. The ground shakes under 8,000 hooves. The crusader war horses, destriers bred for this moment, reach full gallop. The Muslims had seen charges before, but never like this. This is 7 days of suppressed violence released in a single moment. The knights aren't just attacking, they're unleashing every second of frustration, every moment of helpless rage, every dead brother into their lance points. Impact velocity, 35 miles per hour. A mounted knight at full charge generates kinetic energy equivalent to a modern car crash. The 12-foot lances strike first. What happens next is physics, not combat. The lighter Muslim cavalry simply can't withstand the mass and momentum. Their line doesn't break, it disintegrates. But wait, the numbers don't add up unless you understand medieval cavalry dynamics. The first impact is just the beginning. Lances shatter on impact, but the knights don't slow. They draw swords and become a cutting machine. The war horses themselves are weapons, trained to bite, kick, and trample. Each knight is the apex of a killing triangle, rider above, horse below, momentum carrying both forward. In medieval warfare, discipline was worth 10,000 swords. The Muslim forces had superior numbers, but fought as individuals. The Crusaders maintained formation even in the chaos of melee. The Hospitaller wedge punches through Taqi al-Din's wing like a spear through parchment. Garnier de Nablus, first into the enemy, personally cuts down 3 emirs. The Sultan had underestimated one crucial factor, the psychological impact of released tension. The Hospitallers' rage had been building for 7 days. Saladin gave them a target. They don't just fight, they butcher. Muslim warriors who stood firm against ordinary charges break and run. Richard's center wedge smashes into the Mamluk core. The Lionheart himself leads from the front, his sword rising and falling in a rhythm of death. Eyewitnesses describe him as a giant dealing death with every blow. His household knights form an unstoppable steel fist around him. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the battle. For the Muslims, where thousands had drummed and screamed, now only Christian war cries filled the air. Saint George, Deus Vult, Montjoie. The psychological reversal is complete. The hunters have become the hunted. But the second charge was even deadlier than the first. The Templars on the left, seeing the success, adjust their angle. They strike the Muslim flank, just as Taqi al-Din's wing begins to crumble. It's a hammer and anvil moment. Muslims caught between Hospitaller fury and Templar precision die by the hundreds. Here's where knowing history changes how you see the world. Medieval battles usually ended when one side broke. But the Crusader knights, unleashed after 7 days of restraint, don't want prisoners or glory. They want vengeance. The pursuit becomes a slaughter. Saladin watches his center evaporate. His personal guard forms around him as the Mamluk elite. His finest warriors simply cease to exist as a fighting force. The Sultan tries to rally his reserves, but panic is contagious. Men who've never fled in their lives see the cream of Muslim cavalry running and follow suit. What Saladin saw in that moment haunted him forever. Richard the Lionheart, blood-soaked, leading a third charge directly at the Sultan's position. This isn't the controlled charge of knights seeking ransom. This is extermination. The Muslim reserve doesn't wait for impact, they break. Saladin's banner falls, not captured, but abandoned as its bearers flee. The greatest Muslim general of the age is swept away in the rout, his bodyguard literally dragging him from the field. From first impact to total collapse, 17 minutes. The ground drank more blood in 1 hour than most battlefields see in a day. Knights pursue fleeing Muslims for 3 miles. The killing only stops when war horses, exhausted from the charge, can run no more. Even then, crossbowmen continue picking off stragglers until Richard finally sounds recall. When titans clash, mathematics becomes mythology. The Crusaders had charged with 2,000 knights. They return with 1,950. Total Crusader casualties for the entire battle: 700, mostly infantry killed during the morning's harassment. The Muslim dead carpet, the plain. In 17 minutes, an empire's confidence died. The killing ground at Arsuf defied belief. Muslim bodies lay in windows where the charges had struck. Riderless horses wandered among the dead. High-ranking emirs, identified by their rich armor, lay twisted in the dust. The cream of Saladin's army, destroyed in less time than it takes to say morning prayers. 7,000 bodies in 17 minutes. Let that sink in. Medieval battles rarely produce such lopsided casualties. At Hastings, armies fought all day to produce 7,000 dead total. At Arsuf, that was just the Muslim toll. The 10-to-1 kill ratio seemed impossible, but the corpses didn't lie. The counting began immediately. Richard ordered a tally, partly to assess victory, partly to prevent looting disputes. Frankish chroniclers walked the field with scribes. They stopped counting individual dead at 7,000. Some estimates ran higher. Turkish sources admitted to 5,000 elite cavalry lost. The truth probably lies between. What Richard did next defied every rule of medieval warfare. His knights begged to pursue Saladin's fleeing army. We can destroy them completely. On to Jerusalem. But the Lionheart, even in victory's intoxication, maintained strategic clarity. No, we march to Arsuf as planned. But Richard's next decision shocked everyone, including his own nobles. He refused to pursue. The routed Muslim army could have been annihilated. Saladin himself might have been captured. Jerusalem lay open. Yet Richard ordered his men to reform, collect their wounded, and continue the methodical march to Arsuf. Why? Because Richard understood something his knights didn't. The Crusader army was exhausted. 7 days of marching, fighting, and dying had drained them. The horses were blown. Pursuit into unknown territory could turn triumph into disaster. Discipline had won the day. Lack of discipline could still lose it. The psychological shockwave rippled across the Levant within days. Saladin's aura of invincibility, carefully built since Hattin, shattered like his battle line. Emirs who'd never questioned the Sultan's judgment began whispering. Garrisons that would have fought to the death started considering terms. Here's where legend meets cold, hard reality about medieval warfare psychology. Before Arsuf, Muslim armies believed Frankish knights were formidable but beatable. Bait them into rash charges, surround them, destroy them piecemeal. Arsuf proved that a disciplined Crusader charge, properly timed and supported, was literally unstoppable. The myth died harder than the men who'd believed it. Saladin's own chronicle admits, the Franks fought like demons that day. Their charge was as the day of judgment. Another Muslim writer described it more poetically. They came like mountains of iron rolling down upon us. You have to understand what 7,000 dead means in medieval terms. These weren't conscript levies. The Mamluks alone represented decades of training, fortunes and equipment. Emirs who died led extended households. Each fallen commander meant entire units might dissolve. Saladin hadn't just lost a battle, he'd lost a generation of leadership. In 3 minutes, an empire's confidence died. The immediate strategic consequences were staggering. Jaffa, which Saladin had planned to defend desperately, opened its gates without resistance when Richard approached. Ascalon's garrison began negotiations. The coastal road to Egypt, Saladin's lifeline, lay exposed. But the real genius wasn't the charge itself, it was what the charge represented. Richard had turned Saladin's greatest strength, mobility, and harassment into a trap. By enduring 7 days of torment, by appearing vulnerable, he'd lured the Sultan into committing forces for a decisive battle. Then he'd sprung the trap with perfect timing. History pivoted on a single trumpet blast. If Richard had charged too early, before Saladin fully committed, the Muslims could have withdrawn. If he'd waited too long, the Hospitallers would have been destroyed. The margin between disaster and triumph measured in heartbeats. The silence, after 7,000 men die, is deafening. As the sun set on September 7th, 1191, Crusaders knelt among the corpses to pray. They'd won more than a battle. They'd proven that discipline, patience, and perfect timing could overcome any odds. The road to Jerusalem lay open. What followed wasn't celebration but exhausted relief. Knights who'd maintained iron discipline for 7 days collapsed where they stood. Wounded were tended, horses were watered, the dead were buried. But every man knew they'd been part of something extraordinary. The battle was over, but the war for the Holy Land had just shifted dramatically in their favor. Arsuf's impact echoed far beyond the blood-soaked plain. Within weeks, Saladin agreed to negotiations he'd previously scorned. The Sultan, who'd sworn to drive every Frank into the sea, now offered truces. Jerusalem, while never recaptured, became a point of negotiation rather than non-negotiable jihad. The battle revolutionized medieval military thinking. Before Arsuf, conventional wisdom held that lighter, mobile forces would always defeat heavier knights through attrition. Richard proved that disciplined heavy cavalry, properly employed, remained the ultimate shock weapon. European armies would study Arsuf for centuries. But Arsuf's greatest victory was also its tragedy. Richard had proven crusader arms could still dominate. But he'd also proven something darker. Such victories required superhuman discipline and perfect circumstances. Few commanders possessed Richard's genius. Fewer armies could maintain such restraint under pressure. The evolution of combined arms tactics accelerated after Arsuf. Richard's coordination of infantry crossbowmen with cavalry showed the future of warfare. The old model of knights charging independently died at Arsuf. Integrated forces, acting in concert, became the new paradigm. Modern military academies still study Arsuf as a masterclass in operational patience. The principle, absorb punishment to lure an enemy into overcommitment, then strike with concentrated force, appears in conflicts from Waterloo to Desert Storm. Richard's calculated restraint became a template for defeating numerically superior foes. When patience becomes a weapon, numbers become irrelevant. Saladin learned that day what Pyrrhus had discovered centuries earlier. Some victories cost more than defeats. The Sultan never again met Crusader knights in open battle. The remainder of his conflict with Richard became a war of sieges and negotiations. The myth of invincibility, once shattered, could never be rebuilt. Saladin remained a great commander, but his troops never forgot Arsuf. In subsequent encounters, Muslim cavalry showed reluctance to close with formed knights. The psychological wound outlasted the physical casualties. Richard's restraint from pursuit, initially criticized, proved strategically brilliant. By maintaining discipline, even in victory, he preserved his army intact. The subsequent capture of Jaffa and advance on Jerusalem proceeded from a position of strength, not exhausted triumph. The Lionheart earned his epithet not through the charge, any brave knight could charge, but through the iron will that held that charge for 7 agonizing days. True courage wasn't attacking, it was enduring. The hardest battles are fought not with swords, but with patience. Closing callback. 12,000 had indeed crushed 30,000, not through strength, but through the deadliest weapon of all, discipline. At Arsuf, Richard the Lionheart didn't just defeat Saladin's army, he defeated the Sultan's entire strategic doctrine. By turning suffering into tactical advantage, by transforming defensive endurance into offensive annihilation, he gave the Crusades their greatest single victory. The age of Saladin's invincibility ended in 17 minutes. But those 17 minutes had been purchased with 7 days of blood, sweat, and superhuman restraint. In war, as Richard proved at Arsuf, victory belongs not to the strongest or the most numerous, but to those who choose the perfect moment to unleash hell.